Okay, let's take a look at a good essay that addresses the issue that you have been given. Was the sentence that Judge Aaron Persky gave to Brock Turner an appropriate one? When you write your essay, the first page will be your title page. And keep in mind that you have a typing template in the modules, and it will set it up and prompt you to add the important information. So the first thing that you have to keep in mind is that you have to have a title. And the title for an academic paper will have two parts. You'll have the first part, a colon, and the second part. The first part of the title needs to be the topic that you're writing about. In this case, that's the Brock Turner sentence. So quite likely we will all have something that is very similar in the first part because we're all addressing this particular topic. The second half of the title will be your conclusion. It won't be the entire conclusion. It will be a hint as to what your conclusion is. You want to keep it brief. You want to keep it under 50 letters. And if you can make it clever, that's all the better. But do not make it clever and sacrifice clarity. The point of this part of the title is someone who is looking through a stack of essays could look at yours and say, yes, this is going to pertain to what I'm writing about. I'm going to pull this one out to read. Then, of course, you will have your identifying information that follows that. Your section number is at the top of the page in the Canvas site, so you should be able to find that quite easily. And then up here it asks for the short title. When they're talking about the short title, they're talking about the second half of the two-part title. Not the entire thing, but just the second half. And when you put that into the running header, it should populate every page for you. Okay, when you get to the first page of the editorial essay, it's going to ask for the full title up at the top again, so that it's there for the reader when they start reading. And then, of course, from then on, we will just have the second half at the top of each page, because that's part of your running header. Now, your first paragraph should be the introduction. The hard and fast rule is that the last sentence of the introduction, and I have it underlined here, should be your thesis statement, which will be your conclusion. Your conclusion is the most terse, it's the most directed, it's the most forceful way of getting into the essay. In English 101, you were probably taught to write the standard academic three-part thesis statement where you gave your conclusion and then you blueprinted your reasons. Editorial arguments are theoretically so short that to do that is sort of redundant. That's not necessary. And so you could certainly do that. It's just not the most forceful way. What I'm expecting you to do is to end with your conclusion. But I do expect that conclusion to be the final sentence of the introduction. Now remember that the introduction has three parts. The first part of the introduction is the attention-getting device. And Arturo decided to start the introduction with a rhetorical question. There is a rule about rhetorical questions. If you start the introduction with a question, or if you ask a question, you must answer it. If you ask the reader a question and you don't answer it, he's going to spend the remainder of the introduction trying to find the answer or answer it for himself. It's instinctual when you ask a question that the reader tries to find the answer. The exception to that is a yes or no answer. And that is another issue in itself, that if you ask me, have you ever known someone who is the victim of rape? That's a yes or no answer. And I answer no, then you have just told me that the introduction or this paper doesn't really apply to me. It's not of interest to me at all. So even with a yes or no answer, you would want to answer that. Have you ever known someone who is a victim of rape? Well, 1,374,000 people have answered the question yes, so that now you give me a reason to see why that might be of interest to me. Anyway, this question is, what is justice? And then you'll notice that the reader starts talking about that idea. Then you move from your introduction or your attention-getting device into the context part, the background to the issue, and that becomes about the case itself. So you'll notice that Arturo does that by saying the debate about the nature of justice was the center of the Brock-Turner case. Now we have introduced our topic. And Arturo then gives me important background. Now notice that he doesn't go into a long discussion about what happened that night. This is an editorial essay. Your introduction shouldn't be the major part of your essay. Instead, what he did was say, well, he was arrested and he was convicted, because that's the important part, right? We're talking about the sentencing. But he does go into great depth about the sentence. And that is particularly important because remember, when you're talking about whether it's appropriate, we have to talk about the fullness of the sentence, not just an isolated part or parts. Also, you may notice that none of this is cited. That is because this is what we call common knowledge. Excuse me. This is called common knowledge. Common knowledge is factual data that can be found in 3 or more sources. And of course, if you look at the right sources, you can easily find this information. But a key term there is if you can find it in Wikipedia, it's common knowledge. And common knowledge does not have to be cited unless you quote portions of it, which means you take passages word for word out of the Wikipedia, or you paraphrase it word for word. In other words, you may use your own words and sentence structure, but you've clearly taken the entry and you've written it and substituted synonyms and moved it around. So if you relied heavily on it, then it has to be cited. The reason that I had you cite Wikipedia in your review of the literature was because that was the first time most of you had read anything about the case. The first time you encounter information, it cannot be common knowledge. You have to have read it in at least 3 or more separate sources for it to be common knowledge. But by this point, all of this information is common knowledge and does not need to be cited. And then Arturo transitions into the conclusion. And notice that he does that transitioning by previewing what his reasons are going to be. It made sure that society was kept safe and that Turner would never offend. You don't have to do that, but that is a nice way to transition into your conclusion statement. Okay, let's move to the first paragraph. Now, remember that in this essay, you have to do paraphrases and you have to do quotations. You have to do at least one of each. You can do them wherever in the essay you want to do them, but you have to do at least one of each, and you can do as many of each as you need to. Okay? So Arturo, for whatever reason, decides that he's going to paraphrase in this first paragraph. So he starts with his discussion point, which is that supporting reason, that discussion point on your outline that we worked on in class. And he used the because then statement pattern because it works quite well and it's very clear, and he added a transition. But his first discussion point is because Turner's sentence keeps society safe, it was appropriate. Now he's going to follow with his first supporting reason. How did it keep society safe? Didn't just jump into a quotation. He started with how that happened. And you'll notice that he does that in this sentence here. Now he follows up with evidence. And the evidence that he follows up with doesn't just repeat this. In other words, he doesn't give a quote and say, Turner was sentenced as a sex offender for the rest of his life. No, what he does is he alludes to that, but he gives us more information. He gives us information about why being sentenced to a sex offender keeps society safe. And he does that by giving us the details from this paraphrased source that Turner's actions are going to be tracked for the rest of his life. And remember that you can use brief quoted passages or phrases within a paraphrase if you think that it gives the paraphrase, it says just exactly what you want it to say in just exactly the right way. But that needs to not be more than one brief phrase that is quoted. And if you do that, then put it in quotation marks, because otherwise this would be plagiarism without the quotation marks. And then, of course, he writes his explanation, and he does that by starting with keeping society safe means isolating dangerous parties. He talks about how sex offender registry in more detail, how that isolates those parties, and then he ties it together. And so we have our explanation. Now, theoretically, Arturo, could have stopped there, but he chose not to. He wanted to make a more convincing argument. He wanted to take it to the next level, because you can say over and over and over again that he is tracked, but Arturo is thinking critically, and he's also trying to add some insight into his paragraph. And he wants to talk about how, okay, not only does sex offender registry isolate him, but it is a better alternative to prison. So he adds a second C pattern. He goes into his second supporting reason. And because long jail term is proven not to work, the latter is a better choice. And then he goes back to his sources and he tells us why that is true. Now, what you're going to notice here is that the credentials of the people who are being quoted are being paraphrased, and I forgot to highlight this here for you. So this is sort of a continuation, different paragraphs, okay? But they this is all one long paraphrase. So it starts here with your author tag and then it ends here, and the author is repeated here, so I blacked it out. So you have the credentials of the person because this is expert testimony, and you want the reader to know that the people who are testifying to this know what they're talking about. It's just not some journalist somewhere. It's not some lawyer. It's actually somebody who has studied this, sociology and criminal justice professors, and they give us this information. And then once again, we have an explanation that sort of ties everything together. End of paragraph 1. Now we're going to move on to paragraph 2. And in paragraph 2, we have appropriate sentences also ensure that the guilty party will not reoffend. Okay. Should take out the make. Should be make sure and not ensure. And notice this one doesn't follow the because pattern, but it could. Because appropriate sentence, because the Brock-Turner sentence ensures that the guilty party will not reoffend, it is appropriate. We could do that. Wouldn't be anything wrong with it. Just Arturo changed it up a bit. But notice that Arturo included appropriate sentences in his discussion point, and he put the criterion in his discussion point. So every discussion point has to have the criterion, and it has to say appropriate sentence. Otherwise, it's going to take you off in a totally different direction. 2 parts: the criterion, appropriate sentence. And then he follows with a supporting reason. Now, Arturo did something very interesting here. And by the way, this is a student paper. The student's name is not Arturo, although the student did give me permission to use it, but I chose to change the names to protect the innocent. So the reason I chose this is because in class, when we were discussing criterion, I noticed that a number of you picked criterion that were very similar to one another. For example, you said that you wanted a sentence to make the person feel sorry, but you also wanted to make sure that they wouldn't reoffend. And as you begin to write about that, you may find that those 2 things kind of conflate. They almost become one paragraph because you're using the same evidence to talk about both. You can do that if you do that well, but you have to really think about that, how that happens. And Arturo did a very nice job here because he said that he conflated making a person feel sorry with not reoffending, because he said that he thought critically, and he said that the surest way to make sure that someone will not reoffend is to make sure that they feel guilty and sorry for what they've done. And so he sort of took those 2 and put them together, and it made a very strong paragraph. So even though he only has 1 paragraph here, he has really addressed 2 different criterion. And you'll notice that he has a lot more evidence. As a matter of fact, I think he might have 3 patterns here instead of just 1 or 2. But it's a very robust paragraph for that very reason. So let's take a look. And the first thing he said is one way they do that is by ensuring that the guilty party feels remorse. And Brock Turner was very sorry for what he did. Okay. So he didn't need to, the sentence doesn't make him feel remorse. He already does. Just by going through the process, by being arrested, by talking to Chanel Miller, by going through the trial, the whole thing, it has made him feel remorse. And then notice that he goes to a lot of effort to prove that. So we have Dan Turner who talks about how he is remorseful. We have Turner himself who talks about how he's remorseful. And then we finish up with Lasseret, who says that he's remorseful. And not only is he remorseful, but they talk about the idea of empathy, which means you're able to put the victim in its place. Now, could we have used just one of those people? Absolutely, we could. But as we talked about in class in establishing credibility, that Dan Turner's going to be, out for his son. And Brock himself knows that it's in his best interest to lie. So who do we really believe? Probably the probation officer, because she has seen lots and lots and lots of people, and she's got a good bullshit detector. So if she didn't think that he really was sorry for what he was done, she probably would have ameliorated that somewhat in her report. That's our assumptions. If we were only going to use one, we might have wanted to use the probation officer, but once again, I think it creates more of a sense of fullness and robustness to use all of them. And then we have an explanation, once again going back to our definition. Feeling empathy for the victim is what determines whether a person wants to repeat a behavior or not. Why is that important? And then we finish the explanation. Now, once again, I was wrong, not 3 patterns, but 2. We want to move into a another area of why that means he's not going to reoffend, because we're conflating and we want to build this. A long jail term would have made it more likely that Turner would reoffend. So Arturo's doing the same technique that he did in the first paragraph, where he said, okay, this works and this doesn't. And so doing that again here, not only does he feel empathy, but putting him in prison would make it more likely that he would reoffend. And then once again, we have the credentials in the author tag, and then we have this information, and then we have the explanation. Now, this paragraph only has, this essay only has 2 paragraphs, but it's at 800 words without the references page. So clearly we can't fit another 3rd paragraph. You'll notice that you have to have more than one. There is nothing in the world that says you have to have 3. But if you only have 2 paragraphs, they need to be robust paragraphs. In other words, the reader really needs to be convinced. And the more reasons or the more criterion that you can support, the more reasonable your argument appears to be. However, if you have fewer reasons, then you really want to thoroughly develop them so that you are convincing to the reader. Now you get to your final essay, or your final paragraph, and that final paragraph is your conclusion and your summation. And remember that the summation has the 3 R's. And the 3 R's are to reword your conclusion, remind the reader of your reasoning, and then relate to the reader on why this is important. You'll notice that this particular summation only does the first 2. It reminds us of what the conclusion is, and it relates the reasoning. And then it just has a sentence that kind of ties it together. As I get to the end of the essay, I'm left reading, wondering, well, why was it important enough for me to talk about this essay for 22 minutes? And why was it important enough for you to spend 5 or 6 hours writing this essay? What is it that you want us to walk home with or take away from this essay that will impact our lives, or the way we think, or the way we view the Turner case or society in general, or whatever? That is the, sort of the icing on the cake. But if you get to this point and you can't think of anything, and I would say that the summation is probably the hardest paragraph in the essay to write meaningfully, then you can do the remind and the reword and the remind, and then have a sentence that sort of ties that together. Finally, you need to have your references page. Any source that you have paraphrased or quoted needs to be listed in the references page. You list the source once. You don't list it every time you used it, because you have your internal citations there. You simply list the source one time. So if you took 5 quotations from the probation report, you would only have the probation report listed in its entirety in the references page, because you have your author tags and citation page numbers throughout the essay each time. All of the sources that were used in this essay were found in the modules and should be reflected in your review of the literature. So I have no problems with you using them. The review of the literature is there so that you have a fullness, a whole encapsulation of 15 articles to draw from as you write this essay. There should be no need for extra research, but of course, if you feel like you need to find some additional research, feel free to do that. Just make sure that it's documented properly so that I can read the original article. Okay, good luck.